All right, welcome everybody. I am Pato. With me is Umbrella Atlanta, and we're going to be breaking down patch 00.25 for the Duelyst Rundown for this week. Now, we have a lot of major changes coming in, a lot of great quest rewards being changed, play rewards now, so encouraging more just to play, not necessarily so much emphasis on winning all your matches. Spirit Orbs, previously called booster packs, rarity drop rates, have been changed, so hopefully you're going to get a lot more legendaries and epics in those packs. And crafting has actually been changed as well, so the cost rewards are going to change there. So hopefully it'll be easier for you guys to craft those cards you necessarily want, as well as we've actually had a lot of drop rate changes where former epics like Azurite Lion are now going down to commons, so a lot easier to craft if you want to kind of build these decks. Atlanta Umbrella, are you guys excited now to have your hands on like basically better craftable decks and these cards that used to be kind of niche in some cases? They're up in epics, but now they've come down to an area where everybody can kind of play around with them.
Yeah, I'm really excited to experiment now that it seems like if drop rates are increasing, that it'll be a lot easier to make different decks out of some of these cards that got changed in rarity. Now you might be able to see some of the decks that were more, I suppose you could say, premium in terms of cost are now more viable to actually get a hold of. And so I, for one, will be messing around with a lot of different factions, hopefully, with new rarity and card drop changes. So definitely really excited about it. And I'm really excited to see what other people come up with too, because the games will now be a lot more diverse.
Yeah, I think this is something that the community has been asking for on the forums for a while. The last wipe kind of left everyone high and dry, and people really wanted to explore, like still in these early stages, really wanted to try new things, and people felt like they weren't quite there. So hopefully, like the big thing here is hopefully everyone is able to get to that one deck they want to play, or if they don't want to go all in on one deck, they should have a pretty wide collection, so they should be able to build a lot of decks, all focusing on Serpenti primarily. I think we're going to see a huge spike in Serpenti play percentages.
That sounds pretty reasonable. Coming, do you have insider knowledge, Umbrella, that points to this? Are you currently not allowed to divulge those
Insider knowledge on Serpenti. Serpenti is actually my best friend.
Oh, okay. Well, that seems pretty reasonable.
He told me himself.
Now, speaking of community outcry, like wanting to, these changes with drop rates. Similarly, if they've wanted Inner Focus and Songhai to die in a fire, unfortunately for them, they live in fire. So we do have some changes coming in here. Inner Focus costs lowered from 1 to 0, and text change to now it refreshes and exhausted me with 3 or less attack. Tuskboar now returns to your action bar at the beginning of your next turn, and Mist Dragon Seal gets its cost lowered by 1. You guys both have been actually on the Songhai train for a bit, at least Atlanta, like piloting a vehicle, and Umbrella, pulling some sick stats about some of these burst combos. How is this? I mean, the big question is like, how is this Inner Focus change Songhai?
So I guess there's quite a few things that go with this. The first, I suppose, most glaringly obvious change is that you won't be able to use Inner Focus on Hamon Bladeseeker anymore, which is a large catalyst for a lot of these bigger damage combos getting into the later phases of the game where you can actually deal 25 plus from hand, whereas earlier in the game you would need a creature on the board. And so that helps in the sense of playability. Like it feels a little bit like this change will help players that play against Songhai to know like when it is that they're able to push up or stay back, because they can more accurately gauge how much damage they're going to take. Whereas before, if a Songhai has 7 mana and 5 cards, well, you could take anywhere between 8 and 35 damage. 33 probably. Depending on what creatures are on board and what cards are in their hand. Actually, 33... Yeah, I think 33... I'm trying to think of other ways. If they had 6 cards in their hand, 33 guys. But point being... sorry, now I'm getting into stats land. But more or less, there's less high damage options for Songhai with combos with Inner Focus, and so it feels like Inner Focus will be more around minions hitting other minions, or maybe just taking the board more. So say you can use Inner Focus on a Gorehorn only once, because after that it will grow to 4/4 or for however much health it has after the attack, and so you can only Inner Focus it once from hand or potentially on the board if it hasn't attacked yet. So that being said, there's going to be a lot less of those gigantic face plays, more, I guess, I would say more nuanced plays with inner focus now that it's reduced. And the other thing about inner focus change that's really significant besides Hamon Bladeseeker and Gorehorn is that whenever you use Saberspine Seal, you won't be able to use inner focus on that target after they've been Saberspine Sealed. So you're not doubling or tripling the damage of Saberspine Seal, in some cases quadrupling it if there's a minion on board. So that really helps to hedge the damage output of the class, or the faction, but the zero cost inner focus allows you to make more plays earlier with it. So I really do like the direction of inner focus now. And it also encourages the use of creatures like Lantern Fox, which had kind of a contestable slot on Songhai decks before, when you were basically looking at, deal 20 billion damage with Hamon or some damage with Lantern Fox. And you also have another potential deck option in Scarlet Viper, which can be inner focused, and it's also a 5-mana card, which I find to be really interesting, and I'm really excited to see how this change affects Songhai.
Yeah, definitely. Umbrella, do you have any insight on some of the nuances that might exist now that, like, especially like this Mist Dragon Seal, coming down to, do you expect to see this card a lot more? Because before it too, like, it still like was used, but it didn't quite feel as good for backstab units. It was actually ended up being kind of like a cost sink. Do you think that now dropping to 1 and Tuskboard potentially being this like return to hand card being like a big play for Songhai?
Absolutely. I think Mist Dragon Seal, part of why it's changing is because with inner focus changing, you had a lot of 3-power units you were, flying into them. And you absolutely can still activate those units before you fly them over there, but it just it didn't feel like it needed to cost 2. I think Mist Dragon Seal and Juxtaposition always go back and forth on which one feels more appealing at the time. And a lot of times it is good to run some of both, just so you're not quite as predictable in how you're moving your units across the board, or potentially you can build your deck to take advantage of one over the other. But with Mist Dragon Seal now costing 1, it's going to compete with that slot a lot better. And also there are going to be some scenarios where I can see you either using it just for like cheap positioning and a buff, not necessarily because you have a big play to make. And I could also see, especially Atlanta said earlier, inner focus on Lantern Fox is now a very real play. And if you inner focus a Lantern Fox and then fly it somewhere, that extra 1 damage is going to stretch even further. So I think I can see plays where you might, play Eclipse, draw a ton of spells, and have the ability to drop a couple of Mist Dragon Seals in 1 turn just for the buff, as sort of another way to like add interesting layers of strategy and make more like tempo plays rather than big burst plays. And I think Tuskboard does something really similar, and I think it's really interesting to note that the Tuskboard changes, I see them as a nerf, but not as like a straight nerf. Not like you compare the 2 cards and you say 100% it just got worse and didn't gain anything in return. I think ultimately the fact that it's going to go back to your action bar means that there are scenarios. So I guess a good way to break it down is most of the time when you play Tuskboard, you're going to use it. It's going to hit something and take probably 2, sometimes 1, but it's going to take some damage, and then it's going to sit around. And what it's usually doing now is very few scenarios does your opponent have the option to just run away and let it die out. Its clause of dying at the end of your next turn usually doesn't come into play, except maybe sometimes on like opening turn Pumbas. But now your opponent has to decide, do I hit it, take 3 damage, potentially taking 6 altogether just to get rid of it, or do I let it go back to their hand? If they let it go back to your hand, obviously you can replay it, but that's going to cost you 2 cores. So again, it's going to slow down Songhai and bring them to more like an honest curve. That being said, almost always the option you're going to want to do is just to hit the Tuskboard and get rid of it. That's almost always going to be the best option. So it creates these scenarios where sometimes Tuskboard will handle differently. Personally, I've been playing sort of like a cheesy, rude turn 1 Songhai deck that tries to, it uses things like Swamp Entangler and Rocky to lock down your opponent and create a little space in the early game. And specifically in that deck, it's going to be really cool because when you have your opponent locked down, when your opponent's like forced to deal with the Swamp Entangler, then all of a sudden you're going to be able to just play the Tusk Boar, get some value out of it, and then put it back in your hand and try again. But in scenarios where they can just hit it back, it's going to be about the same. And in some scenarios, your opponent's just going to look at it, like if you play it and it doesn't happen to immediately reach them, or you don't get a ton of value of it, your opponent can just look at it and go, well, I can just let it go back to their hand. And I think the last important part about it going back to their hand is if at any point you, like, let's say you have 4 cards in your hand, you end the turn, you go up to 6, your opponent can actually just completely ignore the Tusk Boar because it's going to go back to your hand and just burn away because there's no room in your hand. So that's another thing where the scenarios where Tusk Boar has that extra value is going to be a little bit less, and that's why I think overall it is a nerf, even though I can see where on paper people might think like, man, this Tusk Boar is going to hit me 30 times, I'm going to die.
Yeah, well, definitely some interesting changes for Songhai. Hopefully it makes it a little more honest. Interested to see what you guys think after you get your hands on them on the live servers. And so moving on, there actually were some removal changes. Popular nemesis out there, Eggmorph and Dark Transformation, a card that went from 5 down to 4, now it's back up to 5. Umbrella, what do you think about these changes for removal for Magmar and Abyssian?
I think they're in the right direction. I think part of it is just a slight nudge to removal in general. Dark Transformation sort of was in this weird spot where the game was a little bit faster than it was now, maybe like a turn or so, and there's just no time to play Dark Transformation. And sort of lowering the cost down made it more appealing, but it still was like, it still had the problem of a lot of people were automatically including it in their deck. There are some scenarios where you might not want to run it. It is kind of like a tempo hit. And so the power in it really is the straight removal. And so where it should really shine is like later on. So since it is just like a guaranteed get rid of a unit completely, by moving it a little bit later in the curve, you're probably not going to automatically include it in your deck. You might actually look at Ritual Banishing and think, you know, am I running Wraithlings? Can I get value out of this Ritual Banishing? Or am I going to have to like play a slower game and wait to play Dark Transformation? And so those two spells won't be fighting with each other, and they'll sort of be in like in a better spot. Even though, again, it wasn't like they were in necessarily a terrible spot before. This is just sort of like a nudge away from removal. So I think that's the thing with Eggmorph, is just it's not necessarily that what Eggmorph was doing felt too powerful. I don't think a lot of people were having their things Eggmorph and thinking like Eggmorph is the reason that I'm getting destroyed this game. Like, how ridiculous. But Magmar has a lot of options for removal, so just sort of like nudging Eggmorph to a slightly more cost-effective slot is like a better place for it. And it's also probably, of their removal spells, the one that can afford to be moved. If you had Mana Burn at 3, it suddenly becomes very unappealing. If you had Plasma Storm, I mean, Plasma Storm is moved around over pre-alpha, and it needs to sort of be in that sweet spot. Eggmorph also has sort of the versatility of, by turning something into an egg, your units can frenzy off of it and not actually take retaliation. So in that way, it kind of has like a built-in dampening wave, sort of. So that utility all around, I mean, it was just an awesome spell that did so many things, and this just sort of, you know, raises the cost on it a little bit while not hitting it too hard.
Yeah, definitely taking out those main cards that basically were the surefire removal, getting through, you know, obviously Rebirth units, ironically, and then like some of the new Vanguard units. So now they'll have a little bit more breathing room before they get taken down. Moving on to some more changes, we actually have Blind Scorch getting bumped up to 2 cost, and Murkblood Devourer stats changed to a 2/4. Atlanta, is Murkblood a thing now? Can I throw it in the deck and feel good about it?
I think you could at least feel good about it in terms of playing it by itself, whereas before, if you played it on that 0/4, you didn't really know how much value you were going to get out of it, especially if you had to play it far enough away that the minions that you played on top of it on the next turn wouldn't be able to reach the things that you wanted to attack after you got them out. In certain cases, though, it was still playable in like some niche decks, I suppose. Not something that I would have seen a lot of, but I think that it would have been pretty good with range units before. Now, even better, obviously, since it has some damage to it. You can play it a little bit farther forward, potentially, but you're still going to want to protect it overall. So I'm not quite sure if this change really impacts Mercblood Devourer on a kind of baseline playability level, but it does feel a little bit better if, for whatever reason, say, if you pull a Mercblood Devourer in a pack, then you might not just disenchant it right away. You might go, maybe I can use this in a few decks, such as Abyssian can use it with Wraithlings. I think that it's decent in Magmar as well, because you can push your basic units above Plasma Storm levels. And it's also probably pretty good in Vitruvian, actually. Same reason, you can kind of buff your units above removal levels that would normally affect you pretty heavily, and it also reactivates things, or not reactivates, it can keep things in sort of activation. Okay, I'll ditch the activation thing. It's more or less just a value machine, and with extra stats added to it, it will just have more value overall. That's kind of what we want out of Mercblood Devourer, it would seem, as far as what the card reflects and what it can do is it gives you more overall stats to your board. So I like the change overall. I'm still not sure if it's in a great place, but it's at least playable now, or at least more playable than it was before. As for Blind Scorch, I think that it's a really interesting change, and that Blind Scorch to me wasn't necessarily on my radar of things that really needed to be hit, but on the other end, Blind Scorch is also a card that feels really awful if ever used well against you. Say you play some really high impact guy. I think the biggest one actually to get Blind Scorch is Hamon Bladeseeker. When you play Hamon and it's now a zero damage creature that's damaging you every turn, you feel really awful about it. And I can see certain high drops that rely on their attack power getting debuffed to 0 attack for what was 1 mana being really devastating. Whereas their 0 mana Dispel card leaves you with at least a creature that has a body that you can use to attack things with, just that you lost the effect that could be really powerful. But in the case of Blind Scorch, sometimes the only utility of your units is their damage. And although you can buff a lot of units past Blind Scorch, you still lost a certain number of stats on your minion for a very low cost to the Vitruvian. So I feel like overall, even though the change wasn't on my radar, it was definitely a change that makes sense when you look at it just from a numbers standpoint. It does do a lot for its cost, and so it definitely needed that nerf.
Yeah, definitely an interesting change to Blind Scorch, but also looking forward to seeing Mercblood devour some of my packs after this soft wipe we have coming up, and maybe I'll try to throw it out there on some fields and see how it plays. Now, we did have another Duelyst Community Throwdown this weekend. We had DCT 6. It was commons and basics only, so everybody got to make their decks, but you couldn't use any rares, epics, or legendaries. Joyful Rogue took first, Mokshin took second, Dresbo took third, and Orin took fourth. Most of the players in the tournament played a combination of Magmar and Abyssian. There was a few Vitruvian players out there, including Orin and yourself, Atlanta, and a sprinkling of some other players. But overall, Atlanta, since you participated in this tournament, what was kind of your take on this format? Like was Magmar just clearly unstoppable? Do you think Abyssian was a good kind of counter to them potentially, or how did it shake out for you?
Yeah, I felt like I kind of came into it feeling that Magmar was probably going to take it in terms of ease of use plus just raw strength of their commons and basics, that they were going to have a lot of edge on their opponents given that they have a lot of removals on basics, and they also have a lot of damage on basics, and their basic creatures are among the strongest. So I feel like just overall as a sort of as a value class, they had a lot going for them, and I wasn't terribly surprised on how it went. Although I was actually kind of surprised that Abyssian did so well, because I didn't think of it in terms of Abyssian being strong against Magmar. I just thought of it in terms of, Abyssian doesn't have Shadow Dancer in this format, so it's probably not as good. But when you take away things that make them strong, it doesn't mean that they're left with nothing. And a lot of the effective cards that they have against Magmar are definitely still effective. And one card that kind of went under my nose was Silhouette Tracer, was changed to a common at some point, and I didn't even consider putting it in my deck, but it's a very effective card against Magmar and probably a very common card to include in an Abyssian deck anyway, given that it allows you to close the distance that you create when you make the Wraithlings, and also because it allows you to survive while you're stalling for your win conditions. And I felt that that was a really interesting take from the tournament that might not have been seen on a surface level, is that Silhouette Tracer changes the scape of the tournament a lot, and I really regretted not having Tracer in my own deck because it would have saved me in almost every game I lost. But that being said, Magmar definitely felt like a very overpowering force within the tournament in just commons and basics, but I didn't feel like any of those games were like severely unfair or anything like that. Most of the games were definitely very, very thought out games.
Yeah, I definitely thought it was interesting. I mean, one thing to note just for everybody watching this is even though a Magmar player did end up taking it, there were a lot of great games, especially in the Magmar Abyssian matchup, and overall everybody lost games. Like no one like swept through this tournament.
Yep.
So that was actually a pretty cool thing to see throughout. And that's pretty much going to wrap it up for patch point 25. But last but not least, it's happened again, ladies and gentlemen. We have another member of the Great Duelyst Patch Rundown, and moving on to counterplay. So I have made him a great mural of cute Magmar, and I'm gonna leave it open to you, Umbrella. Like, any thoughts as you part from us?
I'm definitely gonna miss doing these patch rundowns. There's always a lot of fun. We'll have to talk, and we'll have to, whoever fills in my shoes, we'll have to, maybe you can like sneak messages on the screen that are like, by the way, Magmar's adorable, or like while people are having a critical discussion about this awesome new card that radically shakes the meta, you know, a little asterisk that's also like, also Umbrella probably wants to hug it, because I feel like that message is really the core of what I bring to Patch Rundown.
Yeah, if you could leave one thing, it's just like hug Magmar. They're cute. Serpente for life. And that does that pretty much sum it up?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Well, you know, good luck on your next adventures. I'm sure we'll be seeing you around, obviously. So look forward to what you have in store. And I think I'm going to start having to get people to sign contracts now for Duelyst Patch Rundown and lock people down. I'll probably be in negotiations with Atlanta here shortly. And yeah, that's it, man. But yeah, for anybody else tuning in, send your love and wishes in the comments for Umbrella as he leaves us, and we'll catch you next week.